Good afternoon, and welcome to IEP Training, How to Write a PLAF, and Goals or Objectives. This session will demonstrate how Aldian ISD develops the PLAF and how the PLAF drives the IEP. We will also explore the various components of both the PLAF and the IEP. There are several handouts along with this video that you will find useful when writing your PLAFs and IEPs. They are the PLAF and IEP Guidance Checklist and the PLAF and IEP Graphic Organizer. When you make copies, you may want to copy two, one for you to write on through the video and one for future reference. The Aldian ISD format for a PLAF consists of 5 components: the Disability Impact Statement, the Review of Data with 3 resources, 3 strengths, review of the previous IEP, and the baseline data. The Disability Impact Statement states or describes the impact of the disability on that particular subject area. The Review of Data with 3 data sources is where you analyze student work that is reflective of the student's performance. You would not use a data source that is not reflective of how the student typically performs. When the data is analyzed, it shows the student's stronger areas along with areas of weakness. And 3 strengths are just that. You will list 3 strengths of the student. This information is going to come from your data review. The review of previous IEP examines how much progress the student has or has not made since the last ARD. It also mentions your recommendation to either continue, discontinue, or student mastery for the ARD committee. If the student is an initial referral, you will keep the heading, but will put NA for this section. Baseline data is in the area of critical need. It is where you will list how the student does with accommodations, no more than 2, and then with 1 accommodation, or how the student does independently. You then have to determine which of these will be used as the baseline for the goal. The baseline in the area of critical need should restate the skill, indicate the needed accommodations, and the current success rate. Here's an example of a PLAF using our structure. Use this slide as we review each section in detail. First, let's look at Component 1, the Disability Impact Statement. Remember that this is supposed to be a statement that explains how the student's handicapping condition is impacting their ability to be successful in a particular subject or area without using the actual handicapping condition. Note that the Disability Impact Statement has 4 parts: the student's name, the type of disability condition, the actual impact statement, and then the content area. In our example, we know that the student is Molly, has a global disability condition that impacts her ability to acquire basic skills in the area of reading. What the Disability Impact Statement tells me is that Molly has a global disability condition that affects her ability to acquire basic skills. It could be an intellectual disability or autism, but we are not listing the handicapping condition. We want to focus on the fact that it is a global disability condition which not only affects reading, but will have an impact on Molly's ability to acquire basic skills in any of her course subject. To say that a student has a global disability, there must be an IEP in all areas. Let's take a look at another one. Here's our example slide about Scott. We know that the student is Scott, and he has an educational disability condition that impacts his ability to read and understand words and passages in the core area of reading. While not listing his special eligibility condition of a specific learning disability in reading comprehension, we are noting that his disability is an educational disability condition that impacts his ability to read and understand words and passages. That tells me that Scott has a problem with reading comprehension and that it affects his ability to read and understand words. This could be in any of his course subject areas, as reading and understanding words impacts the student's ability to be successful. One of the handouts for this course is the Disability Impact Statement Guidance document. Use this document to help you complete the Disability Impact Statement component of the PLAF. Another handout is the PLAF and IEP Graphic Organizer, which walks you through the Disability Impact Statement. Now that we have our Disability Impact Statement, let's look at the second component of the PLAF, the review of data. In order to start the review of data, you must have data collected for this particular subject. For the sake of this training, let's use the example of Scott. We're going to look at the data for reading. We're going to need a minimum of 3 data sources. If you have a question about a data source that's not going to be listed or mentioned here, check with your campus assessment specialist or campus program director about using the source. Here are some examples of data sources. You can use Eduphoria. You could also use state assessment information. However, the state assessment information is not required if the results aren't meaningful. However, state assessment information is required if you're writing an IEP for IPI purposes. You could also use Frog Street if it's applicable for pre-K. Student work is always a good one. You can use classroom assignments, their work, their homework, tests, projects, etc. Benchmark exams are also another source, as well as the district's common assessments. While reviewing the data, you will want to note the student's progress, not just the scores. You need to explain what the student can do and what the student is having difficulty doing. If you are planning on listing what the student can do in the next component of the PLAF, the 3 strengths, it must be reviewed in this section first. Remember that the baseline data will review one of the weaknesses, which will develop into the student's IEP goal and/or objectives. Your PLAF and IEP Graphic Organizer will walk you through this process. While reviewing the data, you do not have to have 3 strengths or 3 weaknesses, but must at least, remember that's a minimum, of 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses. The data can be input into the PLAF in either narrative form or a bullet format. Let's look at Scott and review his data on his reading PLAF. The 3 data sources for Scott's review of data are most current STAR reading analysis, reading district common assessment information, and classroom assignments. According to the review of the data, Scott has difficulty making inferences, summarizing and drawing conclusions, and determining the meaning of unknown words at an independent reading level. However, Scott can explain figurative language, he can describe different points of view, and interpret maps, charts, and diagrams. He can also use a dictionary and thesaurus, as well as identify the main idea at an independent reading level and compare or contrast at an independent reading level. So now we are ready to go to the third component of the PLAF, 3 strengths. It's always easy to come up with an area where our students are struggling. That's why they're ours. However, in this part of the PLAF, you need to list 3 strengths that you found in your data when you reviewed it. Anything listed must have been in the review of the data component. And it is that simple. You can use bullets here, just list, or you can number them. Just list the 3 strengths of the student in that particular core area or subject. And when we look at Scott's 3 strengths, they are simply listed by bullets. Scott can use figurative language, he can describe different points of view, and he can also use a dictionary or thesaurus. If you'll note in the example, the 3 strengths are noted in yellow from the review of the data. They match. Let's examine the 4th component, previous goal review. You will only utilize this part of the PLAF when the student has a previous goal to review. If the student is a transfer student, you will have a transfer IEP or an IEP from the previous district to review. Or if this is a new annual ARD with or without an FIE, you will have a previous IEP to review. However, if this is an initial annual ARD for a new student referral, then there is not a previous goal to review. You will simply indicate NA for this component and go on to baseline area of critical need. Or if there was not an IEP in the content area from the last ARD, say you're writing a new IEP in a new content area, you would also indicate NA because that content area didn't have an IEP. There wasn't one present. When you have a previous IEP in the content area, you will note the progress the student has made. It may not be much. There may have even been regression. But this information helps you determine what your recommendation to the new ARD committee will be. Should we continue the same IEP or discontinue it? There are basically 4 parts of the review of the IEP. The PLAF and IEP graphic organizer has all of these components, and you just have to add in the missing information. Use the structure on the organizer to complete this section. So when reviewing the previous IEP, you're going to want to, 1, target the concept with the criteria of performance. You might want to answer the following questions. What was the student expected to do? What skill was he working on? What were the expectations of the goal? And that can be the percentage. Then I also want to review how the student performed. I can ask these questions. How did the student perform? This will be a percentage you put on the previous IEP as you're closing it out. It's going to be your last IEP update percentage. You can also ask what was used to measure the student's performance. This is going to come from the previous IEP under method of evaluation. The third area is review the performance levels. To do this, I need to look at the baseline in the previous PLAF. Did the skills increase, decrease, or stay the same? What was the previous baseline? And if there was not a listed baseline in the previous PLAF, you can use the first IEP update to show growth. And the last thing I want to know are the recommendations. Am I going to recommend that the IEP be continued, discontinued, or mark the goal as mastered? Now this is important because remember that only an ARD committee can make those decisions. It's up to you as the staff to make a recommendation to the committee. So make sure that word recommendation is there. Let's look at a review of previous IEP for an IEP that was mastered. Susie is our student. When we look at the concept the student was expected to do, it shows that Susie was expected to complete a rough draft for editing using 3 different sentence structures. We also want to know at what level of accuracy. Well, Susie was expected to complete her rough draft for editing using 3 different sentence structures at an accuracy of 70%. So 70% was the level of accuracy. In reviewing how Susie performed, we want to know the level of mastery and how it was measured. Well, I can see that Susie achieved 75% mastery based on her daily assignments. So my level of mastery was 75%, and it was measured by her daily assignments. So now we want to know, how did the performance increase, decrease, or stay the same as compared to the previous baseline? Well, looking, I can tell that this was an increase from her previous baseline of 50%. So Susie's previous baseline was 50%, and we know with our updates that she's now at 75, so this is an increase of 25%. Last but not least, we want to consider what we want to recommend to the ARD committee. Okay, Susie showed an increase of 25%. The original mastery was expected to be 70%, but Susie mastered it at 75%. The recommendation we would make and note here for the ARD committee is that the IEP was mastered. But let's look at an IEP that we could recommend to the ARD committee to continue the IEP. Okay, let's look at what was it that Jose was expected to do. He was asked to simplify algebraic equations. Okay, at what accuracy? 50% mastery. So we know that Jose was expected to simplify algebraic equations at 50% mastery. But how did he do? At our last update, we show he achieved 40% accuracy. Based on what? Well, daily assignments. So we also know that Jose did make 40% accuracy on his daily assignments, which is part of classroom assignments. We also need to know now, did the performance increase, decrease, or stay the same? Okay. Jose's baseline from his previous PLAF was at 10%, so there was an increase of 30%. From the 10% to 40% equals the 30. Now, what do we want to recommend? He did not make the mastery criteria 50%, so the IEP was not mastered. But you know, he did get really close, and 30% is a great amount of progress. So we may want to recommend to the new ARD committee that we continue this IEP and embed it in the new IEP. That would be our recommendation. But what about an IEP that we may want to recommend that the IEP be discontinued? Let's look at Peter's review of previous IEP. Okay, first thing we want to know, what was it that Peter was expected to do? He was expected to answer questions using linear plots, flashbacks, and foreshadowing. At what accuracy? 50%. So we know that Peter was expected to answer questions using linear plot at 50% accuracy. But how did he do? He achieved 25%. Based on what? His daily assignments. So we also know that Peter did make 25% accuracy on his daily assignments. Now we need to know, did the performance increase, decrease, or stay the same? Okay, baseline was at 25% when he started this IEP, and he is currently at 25%. So there has not been an increase or decrease. Peter is basically at the same level. So what do we want to recommend to the ARD committee? Since Peter did not make any progress, we may want to discontinue this IEP and work on something else, as Peter does not seem to have the prerequisite skills needed at this time to answer questions using linear plot. So we can remember, please remember, that you can only make recommendations to the ARD committee, that it is up to the ARD committee to discontinue an IEP. So let's go back to Scott and do the component for previous goal review. Let's look at what was it that Scott was expected to do. Comprehend, synthesize, and make logical connections between ideas within a text and across 2 or 3 texts. At what accuracy? 70%. So we know that Scott was supposed to comprehend, synthesize, and make logical connections between ideas within a text and across 2 or 3 texts at 70% accuracy. But how did he do? He achieved 46%, and based on what? His classroom assignments. So we also know that Scott did make 46% accuracy on his classroom assignments. So now we want to know, did the performance increase, decrease, or stay the same? His previous baseline was at 25%. So we're going to show an increase from the 25% to 46%, which is 21%. So what are we going to recommend to the ARD committee? While he did make 21% increase to 46%, he did not make it to 70%, but he is getting there. Let's recommend to the new ARD committee that we continue the goal and embed it in a new IEP. Now for the final and most misunderstood component of the PLAF, baseline data. If you will note, we've changed it from just baseline data to baseline and area of critical need for this part of the section. Baseline is one of the most important parts of the PLAF, and it will also make your life easier. Whatever you put in your baseline will ultimately be your IEP goal. So this makes the IEP process so much easier. Remember that while the PLAF lets us know a picture of the student, the baseline tells us where he or she currently is with a particular content area or subject. We see how the student did with particular accommodations and or modifications, or even if the student is moving toward independence. However, there are a few things we want to know about this section. First thing is, the goal is written from the baseline. Whatever skill is identified in the baseline is the same skill for our IEP. The second thing to note is baseline data should be based on the same measurements as the goal and or objectives of the IEP. So, if you're going to use classroom assignments to measure or evaluate new goals and or objectives, then you're going to use classroom assignments for your baseline data. Also, if you use percentages as the criteria, mastery criteria in your PLAF, you must use percentages in your IEP. This goes the same for trials. If you use trials in your goals and or objectives, then they should be in your baseline as well. Do not put percentages in your PLAF and then use trials in your goals and or objectives of the IEP. They must match. Percentages to percentages, trials to trials. Also, last but not least, remember that all baseline data information must be measurable. So note that when you are looking for your baseline in the area of critical need, that it must be one of the weak areas you noted in your review of data. You should have information on how the student did with accommodations. You will also need to know how they did with less support. When looking at how they did with accommodations, look at data with at least 2 accommodations or only 1 if you're looking to move toward independence. When looking at the baseline in the area of critical need, you will need a summary of the skills, indicate the needed accommodations and or modifications, and current success rate, including percentage. Let's look at Scott's example again. For background knowledge, Scott is receiving services in the resource classroom setting. So when we look at reading material at instructional level, it shows that this is modified content and is going to be below grade level. His baseline with accommodations indicates that when Scott is given reading passages at his instructional level, which remember is modified content, and oral administration, because I know it was read to him, note the 2 different accommodations. He is successful at 70% of the time, or 70% mastery. His baseline with the reduced accommodations indicates when the material is at his instructional level, is not read to him, that Scott is able to comprehend at 20% accuracy. But while Scott reads it independently, he is less successful. This is the area to be targeted. He needs to work on increasing his comprehension level when reading material at his instructional level independently on his new IEP. The baseline area of critical need indicates that Scott comprehends reading passages at his instructional level, which is 20%. For his baseline in the area of critical need to match his IEP, the behavior of the IEP is Scott will comprehend reading passages at his instructional level. And the mastery criteria must be above 20%, because 20% is where he is today. and we're wanting to work on increasing his independent comprehension level on his new IEP. So remember that when you're working on your baseline, you want to, 1, limit yourself to no more than 2 content-based accommodations or givens. 2, that accommodations or givens should be specific to the area being addressed. If I'm working on a reading IEP, I'm not going to be using accommodations of math charts or a calculator. 3, look at best practices to give those 3 opportunities in determining a baseline. And last but not least, your baselines should be measurable. Now you have your PLAF finished, and you can go on to the next subject, or if this is the only PLAF you will need for this student, you are ready for your goal and or objectives. Remember the PLAF and IEP graphic organizer that you have been using. Let's get it out again because you can use it for your IEPs. When you are looking at your IEP goal, you will have 4 components to that as well. The first one is the time frame, the condition, the behavior, criteria or success rate is the percentage. Let's look at the components separately, starting with the time frame. The time frame is when the IEP is basically due. In this circumstance, it would be by the annual ARD. That is when the IEP should be accomplished, by the next annual ARD date. The condition at this point is independently. We want him by the next annual ARD to be able to do the behavior independently. The behavior part is, that's going to be my standards from my TEKS. It's going to be based on what we decided in the PLAF, in our baseline. The behavior here is answer comprehension questions from reading passages at his instructional level. Then the 4th component is going to be the criteria or the success rate. What are we looking for our mastery criteria? In this situation, it would be, this example, it's 60%. So let's look at Scott, at his IEP. By the annual ARD, Scott, what this tells me is when the next annual ARD comes up, Scott should have mastered this IEP goal. With condition, the second component of the IEP goal, we are going to note that accommodations and or modifications were needed for the student to be successful. In this case with Scott, his condition is to be successful when he is independent. Third component of the goal, behavior, this tells us what the student wants to be able to do, and it must be measurable. It needs to be something that we can see in order to measure success, and it should be TEKS or standards based. With Scott, it is that we want him to answer comprehension questions from reading passages at his instructional level. And with the 4th and final component of our IEP, the criteria or success rate is where we would like Scott to be with mastery of this IEP within our time frame. So together, Scott's IEP looks like this. By the annual ARD, which is my time frame, Scott will independently, which is my condition, answer comprehension questions from reading passages at his instructional level, which is my behavior, with 60% accuracy, which is my criteria or success rate. So here's an example of what it looks like, similar to what is in EastBed. You can see Scott's IEP. Now his baseline area of critical need was 20%. The goal is to increase his performance from 20% to 60% in a year's time. So the annual ARD date, if from 10/5/2017 to the next annual ARD date of on or before October 4th, 2018. Now let's look at short-term objectives. They break down the goal into smaller steps that, when mastered, will lead to mastery of the goal. If an IEP goal is going to need short-term objectives to help with the student's success, then there must be a minimum of 2, no less. You cannot have 1. You can have more, but no less than 2. Like the annual goal, the short-term objectives should include the following components: time frame, condition, behavior, and then the criteria or success rate. Kind of looks familiar. Exactly. It reflects the goal. Here's where the PLAF and IEP graphic organizer helps give you structure to complete your goal with short-term objectives. For your time frame, use natural breaks in time, such as at the end of the first semester, or the end of the fall semester, the end of the spring semester, etc. You can also use at the end of the 17-18 school year, or by the annual ARD, or by the next annual ARD. You could also use by the end of the first grading period, the end of the second grading period, end of the third, end of the fourth. You get it. So let's look at Scott's short-term objectives. Objective 1. By the end of the first semester, which is the time frame, Scott will independently, that's our condition, answer comprehension question from reading passages at his instructional level, which is my behavior, with 40% accuracy. That's going to be our criteria success rate. And objective 2. By the annual ARD, my time frame, Scott will independently, there's my condition, answer comprehension questions from reading passages at his instructional level, there's my behavior, with 60% accuracy, which is my criteria success rate. So got them all there. All 4 parts are there. But did you notice that objective 2 is the same as my annual goal for Scott? That's correct. You will always want to use the annual goal for your last short-term objective. Also note that I'm not stating accuracy is measured by. I do not need to. If you'll note, eSped has a separate area to indicate who was the implementer and what is being used as a method of evaluation. It's stated there. Therefore, I do not need it in my actual goal and or my short-term objective. Now, something to remember about IEPs are: number 1, students will always have an IEP for their area of eligibility. As an example, I have a specific learning disability in math, reasoning, and reading comprehension. The student will always have an IEP for math and reading. So any area of eligibility gets an IEP. Another one is the curriculum drives whether or not the student will receive a goal-only IEP or a goal with short-term objectives. Any student who is not receiving a modified or an alternate curriculum can have a goal-only IEP. Let me repeat that. Any student who is not receiving a modified or an alternate curriculum can have a goal-only IEP. So any student who is receiving a modified or an alternate curriculum must have a goal with short-term objectives. And then also you need to consider any subject where a student receives special ed support will need an IEP. An example would be, let's say I have a student in high school in English 1. They're going to need a reading and a writing IEP regardless of the area of eligibility. Let's say that student is a specific learning disability with a reading comprehension. He will also receive a writing IEP because he's getting special ed support. Let's see if these notes about IEPs will kind of help with some of your questions. We need to note these. The first one, IEP goals and short-term objectives should always be individualized for students. No two should look the same. That's nothing new, guys. Cookie cutter IEPs are not acceptable because they're called individual education plans for a reason. We've kind of discussed this already. If you have a student in English language arts, they're going to need an IEP for both writing and reading, not just one area. Also, if they qualify in an area, you must have an IEP in that area. Let's say I have a student that qualifies in math calculations and math reasoning. They're going to need an IEP for each math qualifying area. So they're going to need one for math calculations and one for math reasoning. Also, that student receiving a modified curriculum must have a goal with at least 2 short-term objectives. Note also that a student in a resource classroom setting should typically have support in science and social studies. So, and remember guys, science and social studies are not necessarily qualifying areas. However, because we're giving them support in science and social studies, it's going to require an IEP. Also, students in high school with a modified content, you want to select the content strand that will go from one course to another, not be course specific. For example, you want to look at content processes that will go from one subject to another, like Algebra 1 and Geometry, Texas history, U.S. history. You want to concentrate more on the content processes. What processes do I use in social studies? What processes do I use in science that go across the board? Also, there are areas that must have at least one goal with 2 short-term objectives. Remember, those were those modified and alternate curriculum areas. For inclusion, it's co-teach modified. You're going to need at least 2 short-term objectives. If I'm in SLC, SPPCD, or TSC, you're going to want one goal with at least 2 short-term objectives. Also, students that are in self-contained placements such as RDSPD, resource, or instruction in deaf ed. And let's touch briefly on data collection real quick. You must enter your data collection into eSped during the grading period. It is easier to do if you do it on a weekly basis. You definitely do not want to get behind. Here are the guidelines on data collection. I will also include the guidelines in the handouts for this presentation. Required data entry is going to be based on programming. If you're teaching inclusion, you're going to need 2 data points per IEP for every 3 weeks per IEP. For self-contained, which includes SLC, TSC, all-day SPPCD, you need 2 data points per IEP for every 3 weeks per IEP. So guys, for inclusion and self-contained, that's going to be a minimum of 6 per grading period. You need 2 every 3 weeks. Now for SEALs and my half-day SPPCD, you're only going to need 1 point per IEP for every 3 weeks per IEP. And for your students with a BMP or a BTP plan in Review 360, we're still collecting data in Review 360 on a daily basis. I know that I've gone over a lot of information in a short time, but as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. You can contact me. My contact information is on the last slide. And also Mana Miller, who works with our IEP and who wrote this presentation. You can also contact her. Feel free to also contact your campus assessment specialist or your campus program director. They'll be more than happy to help. I would like to thank you for attending the IEP training session on Schoology.